Everybody, thanks for coming this afternoon to the workshop on saving land and money through innovative zoning, specifically the new model bylaw on open space design zoning that is pretty much hot off the presses out of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. I'm Heidi Ritchie from Mass Audubon's Shaping the Future of Your Community program, and I'm going to give a little brief intro, and then the bulk of the program will be Kurt Gertner from EEA speaking about the model bylaw. And at the end, we also have a little bit of an update from Gene Fox, the project manager for the South Coast Rail Project, on the 5-year update of the South Coast Corridor Plan, which is a plan that identified priority areas for development and priority areas for conservation. So it goes with the same theme about figuring out where we can best develop and where we can best preserve land, and that the two things don't need to be in conflict. We can figure it out ahead of time. I'm going to hand out evaluation forms and just ask you to pass them along and leave them with us before you leave this evening. Always such a question here. Okay, I'm going to turn my phone off. Oh, right. As you all may have noticed, we have local cable here this afternoon filming, so I'll be aware that you are being filmed and open to ask questions during the Q&A, and we'll get them answered. So I think with that, I'll go into the introduction. Mass Audubon's Shaping the Future of Your Community program was established in 2009 in response to our Losing Ground reports, which document the trends in land use in Massachusetts. I'll talk about that a little bit. And we really found that the trends over the last 4 or 5 decades have been quite unsustainable, and we've seen more land developed in that period of time than the previous 300, 350 years, and in a very unsustainable way, and there are alternatives. So we developed this program to help citizens understand the very complex nature of local boards and land use structure in Massachusetts, and to become more engaged in their communities, and to also assist local officials with tapping into the best available and innovative tools. We have a website, it's up here. We have lots of resources on that website, links to other sources of information. We have staff, Priscilla Chapman, who's here today and helped organize this, is located at our office in Taunton, with the Taunton River Watershed Alliance, Boyd and Refuge. We also have an office up in Worcester at our Broad Meadow Brook Wildlife Sanctuary, and I work out of our headquarters in Lincoln, and we also have a part-time project manager. So all of these resources can be found through the website. We encourage you to call us if you have any questions or email us. So as I mentioned, the main theme here is that development and conservation do not need to be in conflict. We need to have both. We can have both. We just need to plan ahead and provide for them. And the real question is, does your community's bylaws allow for this to happen, or at least do they even make it feasible for developers to enjoy this kind of conservation development option? And Kurt will go into a lot of detail about that. I'm just going to touch briefly on the concepts. So here we have 2 illustrations. One of your sort of typical subdivision, large lots dividing up the entire piece of property, basically building out the entire property, extensive roads, lawns, pavement, stormwater, clearing of the forest, loss of farmland, all of the things that come along with that. Whereas with the alternative design at the bottom, you have still the homes, but much more of the land left in a natural state. In this case, it might be farmlands, and it could either be owned by the municipality or by land trust, or it could even remain in private land ownership and continue to be, say, active farmland, but with an agricultural preservation restriction on it. I mentioned Losing Ground. There are a couple of display copies of this report up there. This is also available on our website. tremendous amount of land was being lost to these large lot subdivisions. So residential development was really the vast majority of the consumption of land that was occurring during this last study period, 1999 to 2005. We certainly know that the pace of development has slowed remarkably in the last few years, but many of the communities still have the same underlying zoning. So as things start to pick up again now, are we going to start seeing more of the same, or can we move in another direction and have other forms of development that meet also the market needs? Because we're hearing from many studies that people are looking for other alternatives for mixed-use development, revitalized urban areas, just more compact neighborhoods with shared open space, et cetera, and that these options really are very desirable. Losing Ground documented the sort of 4 kinds of areas across the state. The areas in gray are close to build out. The areas in red are what we call the sprawl frontier, and this is where there still is quite a bit of land available, but it is mostly in that large lot residential zoning type of situation. And so that's where the most pressure is, and this is where we're really focusing our efforts, and that's why we have our offices in Taunton and Worcester. So there are real costs, financial costs, economic costs, community costs to sprawl. There's the whole maintenance issue for municipalities, miles and miles of additional roads, stormwater, dealing with the EPA permitting on stormwater and having to manage that, the impacts on people with the long commutes and inaccessibility to run down the store and get a half-gallon of milk or whatever, the energy costs and concerns about climate change, or just playing the cost of dollars out of your pocket with the rising cost of gas. And then also, the loss of resources, the forests and farmlands that we also treasure in this region and throughout the state, and the impacts on water quality, etc. I'm not going to go into this part in a whole lot of detail, but there is information again on the Losing Ground section of our website. But we worked with the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. They have a very complex computer modeling system called CAPS, which basically has looked at every tiny piece of the landscape across the whole state and evaluated the land use in 1971 and then more recently, and compared every piece of land to the adjoining piece of land. So we're, just for example, if you have a piece of forest and the land right next to it is also forest, that's going to be much more intact for wildlife, for functioning of it to remain in a healthy forest, for water recharge, etc. If you have a forest that's right next to, say, a road or a lawn or industrial development, it's going to be much less intact. I'm really oversimplifying this method because it involves many, many different parameters. But at any rate, what you see here is that the blue areas are the areas that are most intact from a natural resource ecological standpoint. And the white areas are basically urbanized areas, or in some cases water bodies, as you can see. And then looking at what we see a few decades later, in 2005, you can see there really is quite a significant change over time. And the point being that it's not just a direct impact of development on the actual place where a house or a road goes, but that all those edge effects. So when you cut a road through a forest or through a piece of farmland, it affects the land adjoining the road as well as the road itself. So again, we do have alternatives. We have the Community Preservation Act that many communities now, I think 148 communities have adopted in order to help fund purchases of land, and there were just amendments to that law which are providing additional funding. There's just some allocations announced, another $25 million for the state match, contributing to the money that comes in through the towns. And you know, there are other options as well, as landowners choose to donate conservation restrictions, get tax benefits from that, etc. But we really aren't going to protect everything that is high priority to protect by buying it. We need other options as well. And there are alternatives available where you can actually protect significant amounts of land just through zoning. And it really benefits the landowner as well, because they can get their project built, having to clear less land, build less road. It's still a very attractive, marketable development, but it doesn't cost as much to build. It doesn't cost the municipality as much to maintain the infrastructure. And we're finding that these developments are very marketable, very desirable. They have places for people to recreate together, to have common to trails, and the kids can play in a neighborhood instead of being all isolated or being indoors on their video games. And there are many, many benefits. Just to quickly illustrate sort of the methodology, with conventional zoning, there are strict requirements for you have to have X amount of acreage, whether it's 1 acre or 2 acre, whatever the zoning prescribes, for every single lot. And then you also have to have a minimum amount of frontage on a road. So it basically forces this kind of geometric patterning where the landowner, the developer, is effectively forced to build out the entire upland of the property in order to get the economic gain out of it. With this alternative conservation design, the requirements for lot size and frontage and those types of things are significantly relaxed. And there are more requirements for protecting significant conservation features like the forests, the farmlands, the buffers to the rivers and streams and wetlands, etc. So you can get, you know, again, the same amount of development with a very different outcome. So I like this cartoon that I clipped a number of years ago, which so oftentimes we see signs for developments with pretty names, and it's all about what was destroyed. But with this approach, you can actually have it come true, that you still have your wooded acres or your deer run or whatever it is, and as well as the development. So quickly, just to summarize some of the benefits: the lower infrastructure costs, the reduced clearing and grading, protecting water, also preventing flood damage, keeping the homes away from those low-lying areas, our forests and farms, our open space and trails, and really a high quality of life. And there's how to contact me for more information. Again, all of this information, it's in the Shaping the Future guide over there. It's posted on the board. And this program also, all of our presentations that we do at all of our workshops are posted up on our website soon after the presentation in a few days, usually. So you can go back and find it at any point in time and look through it. We're also going to post the model bylaw itself that Kurt's going to be presenting. So, with that, we'll move on to the main part of the program.
Good afternoon, everyone. Kurt Gartner, Land Use Planner, working for the state's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. Myself and colleagues spent some time working up a new open space design on natural resource protection zoning bylaw, and pleased to have the opportunity to come and talk to you, because after all, this bylaw is useless without adoption at the local level. So what I'm really hoping to do today is to be a resource to you. I do not mind if you ask questions in the course of this. I'll do my best to answer them now. In the event you ask one I can't answer, I'm happy to go back to the office and work through an answer and get back to you. But I do want to be, as best I can, a resource to all of you in the course of this presentation. I do want to start by saying a thank you to Priscilla Chapman, Heidi, and the others of the Audubon Society, as well as Steve Smith and the staff at SERPED. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to come and talk about this. This takes some effort to find a meeting space, extend an invitation, organize, provide food, and so on. So thank you to all those folks who made the opportunity for me to come and do this. And also, I do want to ask just briefly a little bit about you so I get a sense of the audience. For example, do you mind holding up your hand if you're a member of, say, your local conservation commission? Okay, how about a planning board? A town planner or other professional planner? A couple of those, okay. How about just a member of a board of selectmen or some other official capacity in that way? Okay, good. All right, just like to have some sense. Okay, so let's talk open space design and its motivation for doing it, and then the content of the bylaw itself. First of all, what you have up here is a map that's about 10 years, maybe a little more than that, 12 years old. It was produced through a project called Build-Out Analyses by the state's Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs through the efforts of Steve Smith and his staff. So it's a little dated, and it was never 100% perfect, but it still serves the purpose that I have in mind for it today. What you see up here, and I realize you can't see the detail, which actually also isn't terribly important, but this is a map that shows in various color schemes all of the land in the Commonwealth that is zoned for lot sizes of 1 acre or larger. And this is essentially the legal recipe for growth in the Commonwealth as of about 10 or 12 years ago. Now the situation's improved a little bit since then, but by and large, this is still the zoning of the Commonwealth, and motivation in part for myself and colleagues to pursue a new open space design or natural resource protection bylaw. We're hoping that we can change that legal recipe that has been extended and have a better future in terms of both conservation of natural resources and in terms of some of the fiscal and social outcomes of development that result from this pattern of zoning. So that's what it looks like on a map of the Commonwealth, but this is what it looks like on the ground. I'm sure you've seen plenty of this here in the Southeast. Certainly this is a pattern that is occurring throughout the Commonwealth, and something that is, as Heidi pointed out, when real estate resumes its sort of normal pattern of business, we're hoping to see a little less of this and a little more concentrated growth, a little more mixed use in city and town centers, because this doesn't necessarily serve any of these purposes all that well. This set of sustainable development principles is one that I and colleagues at the state level have been using throughout the Patrick Murray administration. It is one that we've also been encouraging cities, towns, and others to sort of adopt and use as a basic framework for growth and development. And that pattern of growth you saw in the zoning map or in those aerial pictures doesn't do any of these really all that well. Even this one, expand housing opportunities. Sure, it's more housing, but it's not a terribly diverse housing supply. It's not a terribly affordable housing supply. And that pattern of growth really isn't. This one, certainly motivation, my agency, protect land and ecosystems, and it's not terribly good at using natural resources wise, and there are many of these other things. So part of our motivation in providing this updated model bylaw is to improve growth and make it more consistent with that set of sustainable development principles. Now that pattern of growth, if there's a problem with that, that hasn't really, not a surprise to you, hasn't been a surprise to others, and there have been attempts over the years to do something about it. The open space design, natural resource protection zone I'm going to talk about in just a second is really the latest iteration of a type of zoning that began with cluster zoning, advanced to open space residential design. And I look at what I'm going to talk about as really an ongoing refinement and improvement of a technique that's been in place for some time. So you'd say, okay, again, all the communities that you see up here in color have some form of this type of technique on the books. And that sounds like great news, right? So just visually, 2/3 or so of the Commonwealth has some form of cluster zoning with a variety of names on the books. Sounds good? Well, not necessarily. Problem is, too often, that technique was not being used. Subdivisions were taking the form of conventional cookie cutter development rather than the cluster zoning that certainly my agency would prefer, and I'm guessing many other communities would prefer to see. And that is happening for a variety of reasons. Let me stop and do something I should have done when I began, which is I have 2 handouts associated with my presentation. The first is a copy of the PowerPoint show itself, 3 slides per, with a little room for notes in the margin, so you have that as a resource. And second, a copy of the model bylaw in paper form, and I'm going to work from both of these a little bit as I go through this. And I'm going to turn right now to the last page of the model bylaw. It's a chart that looks like this. What you have up here on this slide is a selection of the items that are on that chart. The purpose of that chart was to take a look at existing cluster zoning within communities and do a little shorthand as to why might those subdivision, those techniques not necessarily be working, not producing the kind of development that you might want to see. And these to me were some of the more important concerns about the existing zoning. And beginning with, okay, too often, frequently, the cluster zoning, open space residential design is by special permit as opposed to as of right, where a conventional subdivision, essentially cookie cutter, is easier. A special permit required for cluster makes it discretionary, makes a developer or landowner less likely to use it. And that to us was one of the key concerns about existing cluster open space bylaws. A second concern was that often these processes, in addition to being discretionary, were pretty long and cumbersome. They got strung out. It wasn't easy to get an answer, and certainly became a bit of a negotiation as part of a special permit back and forth between the developer and the community, and there was not a certainty of timing or certainty of outcome, and that was a problem that we were concerned about as well. Another feature of some of the cluster zoning bylaws that run the books in communities that turned out to be a bit of a problem was requiring a very large parcel size in order to take advantage of the technique. You would see communities with 20 or 25 acre minimum lot size requirements in order to take advantage of the cluster zoning requirement, while the actually can be effective at much smaller lot sizes. Another one was insufficient amount of land protected. There were a lot of bylaws that we looked at that required 20 or 25% of a parcel to be protected, which is certainly better than none being protected in a conventional subdivision. But when your goal is to protect landscape scale conservation, it really wasn't quite getting the job done. And also that land that was conserved, that 20 or 25% was less than ideal. It wasn't the best open space of the parcel. It wasn't necessarily connected to adjacent lands that might be protected. So there was the concern to do a better job than the conservation that was occurring. And finally, another one that was a particularly thorny issue was dimensional standards that inhibited the use of the technique. So even if the cluster bylaw did all those other things, it didn't allow flexibility in terms of frontage or some of the other things that go into constructing a subdivision. It was too hard to actually get the units on the ground and constructed in a reasonable way. I'll talk about some of those things a little bit more as we go through this. So we were trying to go from this to that in the course of this bylaw. Rather than special permit, this bylaw is drafted so that the open space design is by right. It's also, rather than a sort of uncertain process, it's a formulaic process that's included in this bylaw and relatively quick. It does not have a minimum lot size requirement as drafted. I'll talk more about all these. It requires, as we've put it, 60% of the land area in a subdivision to be protected. It looks very strategically at the lands that would be most important to conserve through a conservation analysis. And finally, it offers a tremendous amount of flexibility in terms of lot size, frontage, setbacks, road dimensions, and so on. So that is the basic intent of the bylaws, is to provide something that addresses many of the flaws we saw in current cluster zoning techniques. So, a couple other important things. This bylaw is based on something called natural resource protection zoning. First drafted by a planner named Jeff Lacey and some colleagues. He works for the Department of Conservation and Recreation at the Quabbin Reservoir. And so he's the one who really began this evolution. Myself and colleagues are working on, our efforts are based on, in part, on his. Important to acknowledge that. Also important to say that this is, yes, it's the model zoning, but it also includes companion subdivision regulations and some special permit-based provisions that go with it. So we've tried to provide the whole package, not just the zoning, but the subdivision regulations and other materials that you're going to need to implement open space design in your community. It replaces the open space residential design bylaw in the current Smart Growth, Smart Energy toolkit provided by the Commonwealth. One of the reasons so many communities had adopted versions that weren't necessarily ideal is the version we provided wasn't ideal. Our former open space design model was special permit based, turned out not to have been a great idea. So it addresses the problems. It's formatted to be easily customized. The idea here is this is not something one can just Xerox. It does need to consider the differences in the communities of the region, whether you're in Marion or Mattapoisett or Lakeville. You'll want to make this fit the circumstances of your community. We've tried to make that as easy as possible through a bunch of different formatting things and guidance boxes, and I'll talk about that in a minute. An important factor is also interaction with other bylaws at the local level. A particularly important one is Board of Health and Title V, septic regulations, but there are also others that you'll need to pay attention to and make sure that what you do with the open space design bylaw is in sync with some of the other regulations that are in place at the local level. Just important to mention that. And if you folks are really up to on your land use law cases and are paying attention to a case called Wall Street versus Westwood, this bylaw does address the concerns raised about the open space design or residential design technique that were raised by the Wall Street v. Westwood case. This is consistent with that, and you should not run afoul. I can explain that more if anybody's really interested in the details of that, but suffice it to say, we've addressed that. A couple things. I will not have time today to talk about some of the other related things that go with this. For example, wastewater and Title V. It's important, it's a consideration, it affects yield as part of this process. There are materials on wastewater disposal in the existing Smart Growth, Smart Energy toolkit. You have the address of the toolkit here in your handout. So if you're interested in more detail on that, I will direct you to the toolkit. Similarly, low impact design as part of cluster subdivision or open space design, also an important and related technique. Again, I do not have time to talk about that one today, so I would again direct you to the low impact development section of the Smart Growth Energy Toolkit for details on low impact development and how it intersects with the open space design. And I think that's probably all I need to do on that one, just to note that that's where you can turn for more information on those two things. So why did we produce this toolkit? Obviously, we're an environmental agency. We were motivated in part to improve development patterns that were impacting stormwater, impacting water resources through more stormwater than necessary, lots of impervious surface. A development pattern that was, as Heidi pointed out in her presentation, eating up about, or representing about 87% of the new developments in the Commonwealth, and we knew we could do better. But this technique also is beneficial for other reasons, particularly financial. There are fiscal benefits in the form of reduced infrastructure associated with these projects that also are important to this. And also very interested in this technique because it advances environmental and other objectives. At the same time, it treats landowners fairly. It's important to be equitable to those who have investment-backed expectations. They are expecting a certain amount of value from their land, and this technique is a way of achieving both conservation and other objectives and making sure that property owners are treated reasonably. All right, so turning to the model bylaw itself, let me talk to you a little bit about formatting. First of all, there are just various ways we've tried to indicate what the bylaw is. Anything that is in your version, it's black and white. There is, you see these boxes on the first page, that is not the bylaw itself. That is guidance, information, helpful things. The bylaw itself begins on page 4. So anything that's in plain text is the actual model bylaw itself. Anything that is boxed in blue in my version or gray in yours is explanatory text. Explain why did we do this, what important choice do you have to make, all sorts of things like that. Also, if you look at the top of page 4, or the definitions on page 4, you'll see right here at the top, sections where it says bylaw, ordinance in city or town. That is where you will need to insert something or other relative to your circumstances. Most of them are a little more complicated than bylaw, ordinance in city or town, but there's a choice to be made. So, and that is where you will need to follow advice that's included in these blue boxes and make some kind of decision as to how this is best applied in your community. So that is the basic structure. This looks a lot longer than it actually is because we've included lots and lots of guidance. There are some pages that are entirely boxed just because we wanted to be pretty thorough in providing you with our rationale and with information about how to choose the best way to apply this in your community. And then there are certain pages like this one. All of those yellow boxes on this page is something where the community needs to make an individual choice about how it's best suited to their circumstances. This is an example. So this is from actually the definition section, the open space design definition. And you'll notice that, okay, there's a basic definition. We've also got here in bracketed and colored 60. And that 60 is the amount of open space that would be preserved in the course of a subdivision. Our recommendation is the one we've put in here, but community, you have a choice. We recommend somewhere between 50 and 90. 50 is an important minimum we thought to do landscape scale conservation, but depending on the district, depending on the values of the natural resources or other motivations in the community, we should pick somewhere in that range. And here's some thoughts as to why, by way of example. So let's start with equity. And as a practical and political consideration. In the course of taking this bylaw to town meeting, I'm assuming we're mostly towns. Any cities? No, all towns. Okay, so we're talking town meeting. And so in the course of taking this bylaw to town meeting, you are going to need to basically convince 2/3 of your citizens or 2/3 of the representative town meeting that this is important enough to do. And I found that town meeting is very responsive to concerns raised by landowners that they're not being treated fairly or equitably. And that in this case, what that amounts to is, can they produce the same relative number of houses with the same financial return on investment under this bylaw as they might have experienced prior? And it's certainly something that you folks will need to understand in the course of doing this. It's not to say that you can't reduce the number of units that would occur through the subdivision that would have been possible prior. You can change it, but you should certainly understand when you're going to town meeting the relationship between yield prior to open space design and yield under open space design. There's an example on the second page of the model bylaw in the bracket that relates to the town of Egremont out in the Berkshires. Egremont right now, and this is an example of okay to reduce yield. Egremont right now is a very small place. It has, where is it? Okay, here we go. About 600 housing units at present, and the zoning in Egremont would allow about 5,000 additional housing units. So, small Berkshire community. My view, is it reasonable for Egremont to reduce the number of housing units possible into the future? Yes. So 5,000 more units in a community of 600 units doesn't strike me as reasonable. An example of where I think it's appropriate for this technique to reduce yield. So just want you to be sure that it's understood that that is certainly a possibility. Also, this bylaw deals exclusively with the zoning subdivision portions of this. It does not get into Board of Health regulations, and yet there's the intersection between the two. Pay attention to whether septic regulations in your community would also reduce yield, even if zoning would allow it. It's definitely an interaction between the two, especially when you're applying it to lot sizes of 1 acre or smaller. All right. First and most important substantive matter in the bylaw is how yield is calculated. It is basically done by doing a net acreage calculation, and then dividing by whatever the lot size or unit count factor the community chooses to apply. And this is actual language of the bylaw itself, I think important to walk through. So we're taking net area calculation to account, so we determine net acres, subtract the following from the gross or total site acreage. And again, yellow boxes mean choice. So our recommendation is half of the acreage of land with slopes of 20% or greater. So if the land tilts too much, it reduces yield, makes it harder to get units. Again, you can change half, or you can change 20% slope to whatever is appropriate, but subtract something from the yield to account for slope. Moving on, we're suggesting the total acreage. So any land subject to easements or restrictions, so if it's already subject to a utility easement or subject to a conservation restriction or agricultural preservation restriction, take that out of the calculation entirely. Then we move on to wet things like under a lake, pond, or vernal pool, suggesting all of that land come out of the calculation, not count toward yield. Then it gets more interesting. Okay, 100-year floodplains is most recently defined, blah, blah, blah. That may be a little unusual for some of you in your communities. Sometimes floodplain land can be used for the purpose of yield. We're suggesting it not be included, so we want to pay close attention to that one. Wetlands is defined by Chapter 131 of the General Laws and any state or local regulations adopted thereunder. So again, we're taking out all of the wetlands under state and local bylaws from the calculation. And then finally, 10% of the remaining site acreage after that's done to account for subdivision roads and infrastructure. So you never get a perfect alignment of lots and roads. You always lose a little bit. So this 10%, again, can be adjusted as to account for the irregular lot shapes and the infrastructure roads within a subdivision. And then the calculation for the units is dividing the net acreage by the required acreage allowed density for a unit. And I realized that it's a little hard to follow, so I did an example for you to sort of illustrate the point. So we're talking about a hypothetical, and I made the math easy here. 100-acre parcel of land minus the constrained land. So if they go back one slide, all of this, calculating it all out, steep, wet, roads, and so on. So we end up with 32 acres of that 100 acres lost to one of those things in terms of yield equals a net project area of 68. So we're down to, yes.
Is that example in here? This slide?
It is, no, it's in the PowerPoint handout, but not in the bylaw. So then, hypothetically, again, I made the math easy, divide by the required acreage per unit, so we'll go with 2 acres per housing unit, and you end up with a yield, base number of units of 34 units resulting from that calculation on the original 100-acre parcel. And that's sort of the yield, the development units that under base calculation the landowner or developer would be entitled to build. And then to sort of balance this out, you get to the preserved land calculation. So we'll go back here, okay, the original land area again, 100 acres. The multiplied by required percentage, our recommended percentage is 60, so you take out 60 acres as the required conservation portion of the project. I made this one easy by not addressing density bonuses. And then equals minimum preserved land of 60 acres. So what we end up talking about in this example here is 34 units on 40 acres. That's the development piece of the original 100-acre parcel. Does that make sense?
That's under the 2 acre, that's for the 2 acre parcel. That's what the net would be.
Well, I based the yield on a 2 acre per housing unit, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that the housing in the end, obviously 34 and 40 won't work at 2 acres apiece. It's acre and.
But say it was 1 acre. Hypothetically, it was 1 acre. What would the yield then? 68 units?
Right. Right. If you based your yield on page, let's just turn to the bylaw here. On page 9, you'll see a table that on unit count calculation. It's intended to allow you to customize the yield by district. So say in your R1 district, you 2 acres for a yield of 1. In say your R2 district, you decide 1-to-1. You can adjust it by district to suit the circumstances of the community. So it really can vary. You don't have to apply community-wide in the same way.
same scenario, state the exact same situation. With what we want to do, we want to constrict the size of the lots and the size of the homes for what we want it for, to conserve land.
Yeah.
What would the yield then be, the same? We
You
still
say,
gonna
well,
get, on 1 acre, we still gonna get 68 homes on that 100 acres.
You can adjust the yield to what you think is appropriate. So let's assume for the moment that the existing zoning of that 100 acres is 2 acre minimum lot size. So theoretically, without constraints, you get 50 units. What's important to pay attention to is the ratio between that 50 units that theoretically is expected and what results from this calculation. So that 50 isn't real either. Your existing bylaws and slope and all that are going to reduce it to something. But as long as the 34 that results and whatever the outcome of your prior bylaw are at least somewhat similar, you'll, I think, have an easier time at town meeting getting support for the bylaw because you have a comparable outcome to what would have happened before. It's just that the number of units to 34 is on a much smaller portion of the land. It needs to fit on that 40 acres remaining. So within that 40, as we'll get into in a minute, the actual frontage lot size, we're recommending no minimum lot size. Figure out the best alignment without dealing with lot size or frontage or anything like that.
You are gonna have to allow for sewers, wells, so they fit on the lot unless you put in public water or you put in public sewers.
Well,
That has to do with the size of the lot.
not necessarily. There are alternatives such as common water and sewer. There are or packaged treatments, shared septic systems. There's a variety of ways of accommodating some of that without necessarily going to town water and sewer.
Okay.
Let's see here. Okay, so I'm going through the bylaw sort of in order here. The next section's on applicability. Where in the community would this bylaw apply? We're recommending it be allowed by right, typically permitted via subdivision, occasionally via site plan review if you're talking about a condominium circumstance. In a community can require in certain districts, permitted elsewhere. There's a lot of flexibility in terms of areas within the community you would want to use it. Often its motivation to do this is some type of natural resource protection, water supply, agricultural land, habitat, and that may be the original place you do it, but you really can decide where this best fits. So it's a local choice as to which districts and which housing types to allow. What this really does is it flips the whole arrangement that's typical. Normally a conventional or cookie cutter subdivision is the by right outcome and the cluster is the special permit. This flips it around. So this becomes the by right approach and the conventional subdivision becomes the special permit outcome for a community. It does not apply to homes built on existing or A&R lots. I'm sure you folks know we have a flaw in the state statutes relative to approval, something called approval not required. It means we couldn't apply this, we couldn't require this for in an A&R circumstance. And a developer can still choose to use this voluntarily for an A&R lot or an A&R development, but you couldn't require it under existing state statutes, something I'm hoping we one day do something about. Could also be applied to non-residential development. I don't think this is going to be common, but theoretically this could be done for commercial or mixed-use development as well. It speaks more to that in the bylaw in some of the comment boxes, and I think most often this is going to be a residential technique. And there's one other thing to mention, which is that there's a rate of development cap on non-open space development bylaws included as an optional incentive to encourage developers, landowners to use this as opposed to A&R. It is on page 7 in the top comment box. This is a provision that was adopted by the town of Wendell out near the Quabbin Reservoir. What they have done is say, except for open space designs, primary dwellings are allowed subject to all other provisions at a rate no greater than one primary dwelling unit in any 7-year period. So what essentially they've done is applied a rated development provision to open space design subdivisions as an incentive to use the open space design technique. It's a very interesting approach to this, and something that did pass muster with the Attorney General's office, so an interesting means of addressing this. Moving on, as to housing types, this is again an area of local flexibility. Mostly this is going to be a single family technique, but there's flexibility in regard to housing types. The way we've drafted this is to say that housing units within certain districts you choose shall be single family structures. Within other districts, as you choose, all housing types allowed under your bylaw ordinance are allowed. So that allows you to basically apply this only to single family, or to say it also would apply to whatever else you allow, two family, multifamily, and so on. Allowing it to apply to things beyond single family would further reduce the amount of land required and would ease the ability to construct these subdivisions. Also, I'm not going to talk about it, but there is language in here addressing accessory apartments within an open space design subdivision. Certainly a possibility if you would choose to do so. There's language in here appropriate to allow granny flats, in-law units, whatever you want to call them, as part of an open space design. Parking, nothing unusual about the parking requirement that is addressed there. However, the dimensional requirements are a bit unusual and worth talking about a little bit. As I mentioned, one of the problems we discovered with current cluster subdivision bylaws is they didn't vary the standards enough. They required too much frontage, whatever. And so what this bylaw does here is in an effort to make it as easy as possible to conserve land in units, it has no minimum lot size, is our recommendation. No numerical frontage requirement, rather language that says legally and practically adequate vehicular access needs to be provided. And it does not have a setback, a 10-foot setback to property lines, so between lots or units, and 20 feet between principal structures. But that all is very flexible. So flexible it's unusual for communities to have this circumstance. So this is another example where the bylaw this is what we recommend. Makes it very relatively easy to cite these things, but we've also included language, and this is on page 12, so that if you're not comfortable doing away with a minimum lot size, doing away with frontage altogether, there's a box here that talks about using 5,000 square foot as a lot size, and it talks about inserting frontage as a minimum, rather than doing away with those altogether. All right. Questions?
I'm sorry. There's no room for sidewalks, though, right? It's a 10-foot setback.
Yeah, that's
Or fire hydrants or anything along those lines.
yeah, it would be. I'm sorry, I can't.
Wouldn't that be part of the right of way versus the setback to the property line?
Yeah, so yeah, the infrastructure associated with the project itself, the subdivision would be within the right of way of the subdivision. The setback is between the units themselves. So side lot lines, rear lot lines, things of that nature, as opposed to the right of way. So the other thing we've done here is, one thing we also discovered is that there was trouble enforcing the restrictions within cluster subdivisions. And this makes it really clear that the monumentation or marker, where the boundaries of the open space was pretty important, wasn't all commonly included. And there's a careful provision about monumentation on the boundaries of the open space. As to the open space, our recommendation was that 60% of the land area be conserved, range of 50 to 90 depending upon the circumstances. There is a provision that would allow that percentage to be reduced by up to 10% for land devoted to common infrastructure for water or wastewater purposes. It's an incentive, it's a means of making it easier to develop these. If you can get that into your piece, that land, rather than being part of a conservation restriction, would be subject to something separate called a restrictive covenant. It's a separate part of Chapter 184. But it would be a further means of encouraging these subdivisions if you allowed some of the land area to be devoted to common water or wastewater. There is a contiguity requirement within the open space section. What we found in some of the earlier cluster subdivisions is the open space tended to be a buffer around the edges of the subdivision rather than contiguous and meaningful in terms of natural resource or other purposes. So there is a contiguity requirement. It can be waived if there's some really valid reason not to have the land contiguous, but that is in there. And then it does require land to be permanently conserved under Article 97 of the Mass Constitution, or as a permanent Chapter 184 type restriction. So that ensures permanent open space protection. And then there's a section that gets into allowed and prohibited uses of the open space. Some that address active recreational types of uses as opposed to passive. Important for the community to figure out what makes sense. Sometimes it makes sense for the open space that's agricultural to stay in private hands and subject to an agricultural restriction. It really varies a lot as to what the right uses of the open space are, and that's something you folks would need to think through. There is alternate language in here that allows for motorized recreation on the open space. There was a very vocal contingent from Western Mass that snowmobiles and wanted to be able to snowmobile on open space, and one of the language associated with that included. So there is alternate language that addresses motorized recreation in the open space. And there is a provision that does allow a small percentage of the open space to be paved and used for purposes associated with the open space, such as a small parking lot for access to recreational trails, such as, say, barns or things associated with agricultural use, things of that nature. Talks about the ownership of the open space. Could be a private owner in the case of a farmer, could be a conservation nonprofit such as the Audubon Society, could be a state agency, the local conservation commission, or a homeowners association. In the case of the homeowners association, there's a whole bunch of provisions in here regarding homeownership provisions, including a conditional open space grant. And really what that's done is try to be really sure that in the case of the land staying within a homeowners association, that the open space is properly conserved over time, is maintained, and all those sorts of things. I don't think any of the rest of this is particularly important. Just to say that very carefully drafted by Irene Delvano, who reviews conservation restrictions on behalf of the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, to be sure that it addressed all of the things we'd be looking for and resulted in permanent conservation. As far as the design process goes, this is also an important section. The intent is for a landscape architect to follow a conservation analysis process. Many of you folks have adopted our existing open space residential design bylaw. This process will be familiar to you. It basically is delineation initially of the important conservation area, both primary and secondary. Primary being those that are regulated areas such as wetlands, secondary being those that are important to the community but not necessarily regulated. And then a written conservation findings done and a subdivision that is produced based on the area of that parcel that is least sensitive and therefore most appropriate for growth. So going back to our 40 acres and 34 units, that 40 acres would be designated through this conservation analysis and findings process as the appropriate place for the 34 units to be located. It's fairly straightforward in terms of doing this. One important thing that I should have mentioned at the outset is an informational meeting. You can't require a developer to come in and have an informational session with you to talk through the project in advance. They are entitled to submit a subdivision without that initial informational meeting, but it really helps the process, and we really do ask communities to encourage a landowner or developer to come in and talk conceptually about a project before they formally submit their subdivision. So that's an important thing to mention as well. And then finally, the planning board decision as part of the subdivision review does incorporate the conservation findings and is part of the important outcome here.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
It's a two-part question. First, who does the conservation analysis, and second, who pays for it?
The conservation analysis we have is being done by a landscape architect and paid for by the developer. One important thing to talk about here is advanced planning. These are our open space and recreation plans done by a number of communities. I know you can't see the detail, not really terribly important. What is important is that by doing one of these and spelling out in advance those interests the community has, those lands that we'd like to see conserved, you can use the open space design and natural resource protection process to basically connect corridors and connect open space across parcel lines. It's important in a couple of ways, and also can be done on a larger than municipal level. Important to what Gina's going to talk about in a moment, the priority preservation areas in the Southwest Rail Corridor Plan. I'm hoping that this technique will eventually help communities to preserve those open space sections across not just individual subdivisions, but across municipal lines. A lot of communities adopt this technique, and the developers know in advance which portion of the project, which portion of the site is designated for preservation. Then there is the possibility of connecting greenways or corridors, or to protect larger blocks of open space than would otherwise be possible on an individual project. That's the point there. So conservation analysis and findings, 4-step process. These are from the existing NRPZ guidance that's available online. You're really assessing the existing conditions of the site. You're, in step 2, looking at the constraints, those primary and secondary conservation areas, steep, wet, vernal pools, all those types of things. You're identifying secondary conservation interests such as historic resources, stone walls, historic homes, vistas, things like that. And you're producing conservation findings. Those findings will be guidance to the developer in the course of laying out the subdivision. So all the things that the community has interest in preserving, including those that may have been identified in advance through an open space and recreation plan or some kind of regional plan. One important thing here is that this process is a by right process. This is not a special permit-based process, so the intent is, in almost all circumstances, a development coming in the door will result in an approved issuance of a permit. There are very narrow grounds for denial of a project. Just plain out insufficient information, not enough information on the natural resources on the site, things of that nature. The open space was not preserved as per the conservation findings, or the zoning requirements were just plain not met. This shouldn't be thought of as a discretionary special permit. We can negotiate, we can say no. The intent really is to come to a yes. That doesn't mean you can't have some dialogue around the best outcome, but the intent here is to get to a yes. And that's pretty important. It is a result of some of the things we were seeing in existing special permit-based models. The intent very much is to go with that as of right. Pretty much we'll get a relatively quick and certain outcome as part of this. There are design standards, including site disturbance, street standards, vistas and cultural things that are included in here. Not too important to get to that now. But again, wastewater disposal. The Board of Health must be provided sufficient information on which to make its wastewater disposal decisions, even though that's not part of this bylaw itself. So there is language in there that addresses providing the Board of Health with the necessary information, but it's a wholly separate process that's not really part of the open space design bylaw itself. There are a couple of special permit-based provisions here, things that can't readily be included in an as-of-right zoning bylaw were addressed through special permit, one of which is density bonuses for things that go above and beyond sort of standard requirements of the subdivision. And what you see up here are 4 typical things for which communities provide a density bonus. The first is public access to the open space. The second is construction of permanently affordable housing. Third is conservation of open space beyond that required. So if you're required 50 and the developer instead conserves 60, so there'll be a density bonus for that 10% additional. And finally, preservation of historic structures, all of which are potential density bonuses the community can offer, or others, all addressed in the special permit based section. And finally, shared driveways. Shared driveways really do facilitate construction of an open space design, subdivision, much as flexible frontage and lot size, all that sort of thing do. I saw some smiles up there in the back. I guess I'm seeing this one. Where is it?
Where is it?
Where is it? It is not in this region. I was looking at through Google Maps at. No, it is in Mass. It's in the North Shore. It's actually, I'm not sure I remember. It's somewhere in the it's in that Ipswich area up in the North Shore. I don't Beverly, Ipswich, somewhere in there. I don't remember exactly. But I was looking for something wholly different, and I came across this. Wow. Shared driveways, better alternative, maybe. There's a provision for shared driveways in there. I'll leave it at that. And I think that's enough illustration of why this might be helpful. Case studies. Here's the interesting thing. We have at this point 6 communities that have adopted this latest natural resource protection zoning technique. They are Brewster on the Cape, New Salem, Shutesbury, Hatfield, Hadley, and Wendell. So 5 out of 6 in the basically Quabbin region, more or less, Connecticut River Valley, 1 on the Cape. So that is this latest NRPZ OS open space design version. And here's the interesting thing about case studies. 6 adopted, and I do not yet have a subdivision approved under any of those 6 to talk to you about in terms of the case study. So, I'm not sure that's, but in any event, I do not have one yet to talk to you about. So the examples I do have are versions that are very similar that occurred under our previous open space residential design bylaw. One is Hopkinton's Old North Mill project. In this case, 34 lots on 100 acres, 52% of the parcel protected, so within that range of 50 to 90 we're talking about. And there's details on this one in the Smart Growth Energy Toolkit at the address listed there. Similar outcome to what we're looking for here. Another one that's very similar in outcome is in Bellingham, the Woodbury Ridge project. It's about a 16-acre parcel, 10 acres protected, 6 acres developed, used LID. And again, an example I would point to a similar outcome we would be looking for here. And finally, I will leave you with contact information. Happy to have you call or email me with questions about this. The technique itself is something we're confident can work, and we're happy to help communities work through the particulars of adopting the technique. So I think with that, I'll stop.
Yeah, I think we do have. I really appreciate you coming out and doing this. If we have any questions for Kurt, we can take a few questions before moving on.
I have a question. I'm a Conservation Commission member now, about 10 years ago, I was a planning board member. And we had probably what they call the first generation of open space preservation bylaws then. Kind of clunky, had a lot of issues. And one of the reasons why people in town generally are wary of it, don't like the idea, a lot of the illustrations you showed of open space developments seem to exist kind of not only in open space, but in the space itself. There's no abutters around the property. And that's a lot of the concerns that if you have a home that's in a neighborhood which is on 2-acre properties, how do you feel about a development going in next door on much smaller size, potentially the same size or bigger houses, but potentially smaller size parcels? And that's where a lot of people get kind of edgy about open space development in town. That's where kind of the political will has an obstacle in getting a new bylaw passed. And that we're going to be dealing with that soon because the planning board, excuse me, is preparing a new open space bylaw. And that's probably going to be one of the biggest objections that's raised, but I didn't really see it addressed here, so that's why I'm raising that as an issue now.
Yeah, I think one of the argument I would make is yes, the homes are closer together. Yes, the individual homeowner in that subdivision will have their individual lot will be considerably smaller than the ones that are conventional developments within that community. However, trade-off being open space, basically say 50 to 90, 60 in our recommended formula of the parcel would be open space for all the residents in that project to enjoy and appreciate, as opposed to in a conventional circumstance, not any of the parcel being available as public, or at least in the case of the homeowner association, private open space. And I think the community as a whole will benefit from the values provided by the conserved open space. Certainly the objectives of an open space and recreation plan, a regional plan in the case of Serpent, or a larger regional plan in the case of the South Coast Rail Corridor plan, advanced through the technique.
And I just also added, under a number of these options, it would be accessible to those existing homeowners for the trails and the open space to be used. And I also think it's important for communities to think about where they're headed with build out ultimately. And yes, they may like their neighborhood with their 2-acre lots and these undeveloped spaces next to them now, but what about when the entire town becomes covered in those 2-acre lots?
Another argument I would make is you can have some really good quality communities on relatively. I live in Watertown, Mass, about 8 miles west of Boston, and I live in a neighborhood of 5,000 square foot house lots. And it's a pretty nice neighborhood. You can have a good quality neighborhood in a relatively small lot size. And it's more about how the community is laid out than necessarily the lot size itself. So I would make that argument as well. That certainly within this region, I'd have to do a little work to find them, but we've got to be areas of existing communities where lot size is small, but the outcome is one that people really value.
How long has this bylaw, this current version, been in existence?
About 6 months.
Which generation would you call this? Is this
Oh,
the
gosh. Well, at least the fourth. I would cite cluster, then conservation subdivision, then open space residential, and now open space design / NRPZ. But it really is more of a constant evolution. People basically finding the flaws with the prior version. And if I had to say a number, I'd say the fourth, but it's really more of this constant change.
The natural resource protection zoning actually has been around for a few years now.
That's
It's
true.
been adopted by just 6
communities,
So,
yeah.
and that's very close to this in many respects.
What I'm looking for in my mind is ways to convince people that this isn't just more of the same when it's presented to the town.
Well, no, I think what you'll find here is very different than what buyer right, lot size, all the things that I sort of spelled out there are pretty different than most of the versions you find. So it really is different than a lot of what's on the
The
ground.
buy right part of the part, I think will scare people the most out of it. In our town.
Yeah.
I think the trouble, most people are for conservation. I don't think it's that hard to basically bring that at a town meeting and sell the idea. Our problem is how do you sell it to a developer? It seems a lot more cost. How much longer does it take to get this approved rather than this regular, say, normal site plan? He has to go through impact statements and planning boards and everything else. How much more does he have to do in order to get it to go so he can start selling the lots? And it's time and money, and to the developer, he's looking at the bottom line. So, I mean,
Well,
he's not looking, he's just looking to make a profit.
In this case, what I would argue is in the current circumstance of many communities, the easy path for a developer is a conventional subdivision. It's a guaranteed outcome, basically. The rules are straightforward, as opposed to trying to do a cluster subdivision now under the special permit. That's where you get into the
Right.
and in this case, what we're doing is changing the circumstance such that this becomes the easy path as opposed to a conventional subdivision. So it should, if done properly, be easier for a developer to build this kind of subdivision under an open space design bylaw, because that is the by right path than a conventional development. So the whole idea is to make this easier for the developer.
And there are some case studies out there also that point to the economic benefits to the developer in terms of reduced land clearing and preparation costs, reduced infrastructure to build it. The values of these homes, they are well designed, they are as high or oftentimes even higher. And there's data out there, we can get you some access to some of these case studies. Feel free to contact us.
There are, by the way, projects in the permitting stages in both Wendell and Brewster that would be the first ones constructed under this new bylaw. So I'm looking forward to those finishing the approval process and having some real examples.
Logically, a smaller piece of property and a smaller home, if you're going that way, seems to be a cheaper price for the home. I mean, if I was to buy a house and I can get a Met mansion for $500,000, or I can get one of these homes, I can't see them charging $500,000 for it.
Well, you might think so, but there is a lot of market research out there now showing that there's an oversupply of those McMansions, an undersupply of the walkable communities, and smaller land to have to maintain, well-designed neighborhood feeling, access to open space, sometimes mixed-use developments where you have restaurants and shops and things combined in with them. So there is, again, there's market information out there, and we can get some of that to you.
If a developer says to you, you know, I've got such and such problems with this, let's say you're trying to get this idea through town meeting or town council or whatever, and the developer says it sounds like fewer lots on whatever property, conservation analysis that I have to pay for, what's the strongest argument you can make that would convince a developer to go for this as opposed to the existing situation?
By right outcome and less infrastructure to build. So in conventional subdivision, you're going to have to build more roadway, et cetera, within the development, and you're also going to have a longer permitting process and less certainty in the outcome. Here you're shorter process and less infrastructure to build, less certainty of outcome.
Once this becomes by right, once you do that simple calculation of total land, the 60% or whatever it is, it's just a straight.
Yeah, often in the process now, you may, for example, have to do individual perk tests for house lots or various other things that are part of this. This one, you're not doing that. You're basically guaranteed the outcome. The whole issue of dealing with those types of things and processes goes away. So it's much simpler in that sense.
Okay, I'll take one more question, and then I think we'll move on to the final part of the program. This gentleman in the back.
Do you have any recommendations or any ideas where the ultimate maintenance of the open space falls and takes care of that into perpetuity?
Well, depends, of course, on the ownership. Options included ownership, holding of restriction by, or outright ownership by the community, could be held by the conservation restriction, by the Conservation Commission, could be held by a state agency. So it depends a little bit on ownership. There are enforcement provisions that I didn't really get into here in regard to maintenance, right to go on the property to ensure things are in the proper circumstance, ability to put liens on the property if maintenance hasn't been performed, things of that nature. So it is addressed in the bylaw. I think you'll find that there's means of enforcement.
Okay, well, thank you again, Kurt, and we're all available as resources if you think of other questions or are looking for more information after the workshop. And I'm also mindful that it looks like we have plenty of time. We do need to be out of this room promptly at 6, but we're just about 5:17, 5:20, so I think we have plenty of time. Jean's presentation is going to be short, and so we can hear about the South Coast Rail corridor plan and the 5-year update.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Heidi, and thank you all, Priscilla, reaching out to me. I also do want to thank Serpent, as Kurt did, because without Serpent, none of this would happen. I was asked to provide a real quick update, but my focus is going to be more on the priority protection and priority development areas that we did identify almost 5 years ago in the corridor plan. And I want to talk to you a little bit about where we are status-wise. You know, this is no news to you. I mean, the bad news is we've got this sprawl development. We have issues, but we have incredible resources in this region. And a good part of the corridor plan identifies that. And certainly there's state support for continued efforts that would definitely take advantage of our resources and help us develop economically. This, just as a reminder, Priscilla said, throw in a map so they remember what it is. This is the route we're studying now in the final environmental review process. It's known as the Stoughton Strait. So there's the Fall River branch and the New Bedford branch that meet at Cotley Junction and then go north along the Stoughton route into South Station and Boston. We do own the track in the southern triangle now. That was all CSX track, so that's now state property. The gates of the city in Fall River. So it's important to remember why South Coast Rail has even come back into the picture. It's really basic equity, parity, and economic development. You've got the 3 major urban centers, they're all gateway cities, and they're the only 3 within 50 miles of Boston that are not connected by rail. Certainly the governor and lieutenant governor have been committed to this project, and they have committed a lot of resources to developing the corridor plan and working with the 31 communities that are in the corridor. We, in 2009, not we, my predecessor, Christina Egan, who was phenomenal, worked very hard with Serpent, with the communities, and with the state to develop the South Coast Rail Economic Development and Land Use Corridor Plan, which is now nationally and internationally recognized as a model for smart land use planning and sustainable development. Then in July of 2010, the governor signed off on Executive Order 525, and that very briefly requires that state resources allocated in the corridor region align with the corridor plan. So the priority development and priority protection areas that each community identified and then was elevated to the regional and finally the state level, any grant you get from the state needs to align with those identified areas. And if it doesn't, there needs to be a good reason why it does not. So the plan issued in 2009, and we had engaged in an incredible civic engagement process to identify the priority areas for growth and land preservation. And that is difficult to see, but you can probably access this online and certainly can get it to you. Each community sat down and identified, this is mine, Freetown, identified through a series of over 100 meetings where in their community they wanted to see land preserved and not developed, and where they felt development would be appropriate. We all agree development's encroaching, but how do we manage that encroachment? How do we as communities and preservationists welcome the development that we need, but isolate it from areas that need to be protected? So we have developed a long-term vision for sustainable development in the 31 communities. And that, I have to say, was a huge exercise that the regional planning agencies, primarily Serpent, undertook in going to each community. And each of those meetings differed community by community, but in the final analysis, each community ended up with a report identifying areas they wanted to preserve and protect, and areas they felt development was potential. So the local priority map came from the local process, and then there was a regional map that, again, the regional planning agencies worked on. So that became, they used the local map for the regional map, and then finally we had the state map. Now, basically a priority protection area is an area within a community that deserves special protection for a number of reasons. So the short term is PPA, and it also has to do with specialized habitat, endangered species, and things like that. And then a priority development area is an area that the community and everyone else feels is probably okay. And we can do some smart growth. We can do 40R, we can do 43D. but it needs to be identified by that community as being an area where it's going to work. So we did I have to back a minute. Obviously, the South Coast Rail, it is about smart land use, but it's also about economic development. It's estimated that $500 million a year in economic development potential can be realized once this is fully implemented. But it represents a lot of jobs for people, certainly a lot of income for the region. But on top of all of that, it's important to remember that the train, this commuter rail line, is inherently green. You'll take 300,000 vehicle miles off the roads if people can get on the train. You save 21 gallons of water per day per family if you have the train, and you save upwards of 10,000 acres of land if we can get this train going. And I don't know the last time anyone drove on Route 24, it's not a big one. So Kurt mentioned the Sustainable Development Principles. They're all part and parcel of the corridor plan. I don't need to go over them with you. We also, as part of this, I mentioned, we've done some technical assistance grants. These are small grants. They typically range from $5,000 to $25,000. But they're allowing communities to look at their PPAs and PDAs and do some work around that with resources they wouldn't normally have. And again, this is done in concert with the regional planning agencies. So we've done some bike and ped paths, we've done conceptual designs, we've done open space planning. And in our most recent announcement, round 5, the 5th year of technical assistance grant funding, 4 communities are sharing in concept planning for biking and walking in and around stations and to and from employment. And that speaks to a point that Kurt brought up as well, and that is that the political boundaries shouldn't arrest the continuity you want to see with your preservation and, in fact, with your development. So that was pretty exciting. We did one last year, too, that was 3 communities. So here are some examples. Berkeley did a low-impact development rules and regulations back in the fiscal year 10 round. They did adopt that. The residential development bylaw, the open space residential development bylaw, did not pass town meeting. And as somebody who knows, and I think all of you do, sometimes town meeting can be challenging and it takes more than one shot. It's an educational process, it's a learning process, so I don't think they're giving up. North Attleboro developed an open space and recreation plan. Taunton did a bike and ped survey. Rehoboth did an open space design bylaw in 2009, open space design PowerPoint and brochure, and then development of rules and regulations for the FY11 round. And Acushnet, Fairhaven, New Bedford was another regional initiative, the Acushnet Riverwalk. And I wish this was a better picture, but basically we had sections all along here that were perfect for a river walk, and they were broken up by either a political boundary or a piece of property. In this exercise, conversations went on. This is now ready to go. When they can find the funding for this will be a wonderful, wonderful resource for those communities. It was a great exercise. It brought all the communities together. It brought the businesses in the area together. It really is phenomenal because now it is really in go mode. So we have been a model for economic development and land use planning. In fact, the 495 corridor plan is a mirror. Executive Order 525 shows that the governor is committed to making sure that funding aligns with what we as communities and as a region have identified as areas for preservation and development. We did get federal funding for the 3 bridges in New Bedford, but there's a 4th that I don't know what we're going to do about. We're still working on that. We're just about done, as I mentioned, with our environmental review. Station is underway right now. There's an article in yesterday's Globe on that. The 5-year PPA, PDA update will be, I don't know, Steve, have you launched your first 2 communities, or you're about to? 2 communities, you're going to begin, Swansea and Seacon. Begin the exercise. What it really is it's a way to sit down with cities and towns again, 4.5 years after the original meetings when we were all trying to figure out what a PPA and a PDA was. See if there have been changes that have been introduced in your communities. See if you want to incorporate those changes or if they have an impact on what you've already identified. And then we'll develop a brand new map to go with it. This is not an opportunity to start from scratch. It is an opportunity to revisit and to look at what might have changed. The nice thing about the PPAs and the PDAs is you know, you want this revised map, but you also want to position yourself as a community to be eligible for some of these grant funds. And certainly with the recognition of where they are, that does help. In fact, in our technical assistance round, this last round we just completed, we required that the communities identify what they were doing. Was it in a PPA or a PDA, and which one? And I know that for Mass Works grant funding out of HED, that same requirement is in place. And finally, we're really about developing economically and job creation, but we're truly about sound use planning. I work with Kurt, I work with a number of the state agencies. We're looking for livability around stations, and we want to continue this process of being a blueprint for smart growth. And that's it. But I'm also right down the road in Freetown. So we expect to have our final environmental review documents into the Army Corps in the next several weeks. We're doing what we call the Section 106 process right now. That's currently underway with 3 tribes. So they're out right now doing some intensive archaeological surveying, and that should be completed by January, the final report, and then hopefully in the spring, according to Secretary Davey and Governor Patrick, we'll have a final environmental impact statement issuing. Thank you.
Any questions for Jean?
Yes.
I know one of the issues in this project has been the fact that it goes through the Hockomock Swamp.
Yes.
What is the status of that? How is that?
That's being addressed primarily with a trestle through the area and numerous critter crossings and expanded culvert system.
Is it still up in the air, or is that been resolved?
That's what we're submitting. The Corps could say no, but I doubt that, because actually right now we've got rail bed in there, and it's unfortunately an area that hasn't been treated very well. I mean, it's a recreational area, so it's really difficult. It's the blue-spotted salamander, it's Blanding's turtle, there's a butterfly too in there. All have been impacted by kind of the abuse that it's suffered in its current state. So the expectation is that you elevate the rail bed out of there, you allow for critter crossings, and the culvert system, you'll actually, they've got some pretty fancy directional ways of moving them so that they don't end up on 138, which happens.
Yes.
Just about, do you have an estimated time as to when you think they
I
may
hope I'm alive.
Before they start running the track?
If you may remember, Steve, hope you're alive too. Originally, when Christina was put in as project manager and they had a plan for diesel, it would have been 2016, for electric, it would have been 2017, fully implemented. We're not there. We've lost a minimum of 2 years in the review process. But you know what? That's a heartbreaker. Obviously, we want to see things move, we want to see things progress, but it's been an incredibly comprehensive and thorough process with the Corps. When this final impact statement is released, I don't think there will be a more thorough document out there in dealing with protection of areas, protection of species, and economic development.
You know, where do we stand with the transfer of development rights?
We kind of,
regional version.
yeah, thank you. And I don't know if anybody else is aware of that. We did an extensive amount of work on TDR. To my knowledge, that's just really not in there right now. We need a land bank. You need to implement a lot of things at the state and policy level. Kurt, go ahead.
There is ongoing dialogue between the state agencies on that concept. There is, for example, there are existing land conservation funds spent every year by the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, including funds invested in this region. And we're in the process of exploring whether the existing bond authorization that basically enables us to spend those funds will allow us to use those funds in a revolving way as a TDR credit bank would work. So we're working with Victoria McGuire, the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development, and others to explore whether some of the existing state statutes and funding sources can be used for that, or whether we need a wholly different bond authorization and statutory authority to create a credit bank. So we're working on it.
Yeah, it was all new turf, so by the time we get this built, it may be applicable.
Chief, I have a question for
Sure.
you. So you indicated the final EIS will be coming out in the spring?
That's the
Yeah,
plan, that's what the governor's asked us to stick to, yeah.
And are they also working on a financing plan? I've been hearing all this stuff about the MBTA and their finances.
Right, well, keep in mind that we're not the T, we're MassDOT. This is a MassDOT project. It's not affiliated with the T, so that's A. But B, you're probably all aware that in January, there's going to be tremendous legislative dialogue, and the T is the main reason. We have a problem with infrastructure, there's no question. And, you know, we can do TOD, and we can do all this wonderful stuff we're doing, but our fundamental infrastructure is failing. And so was the process of supporting that infrastructure for 20 years, I hear. So I know that in January there's going to be a great deal of dialogue around transit, all kinds of transportation, not just the T, but South Coast Rail, Greenbush, all the things, even the buses. I don't know, you have something to add to that, Kurt?
No, I think it's absolutely true that the infrastructure generally is part of the conversation, and will be in particularly transportation coming legislative session. Another infrastructure conversation that's very much underway regarding water infrastructure. There was a whole panel and process associated with that, and so I think there's definitely the acknowledgement that whether we're talking roads, bridges, water, sewer, et cetera, it's all not been maintained as it ought to have been over a long period of time, and serious look now at what can we do to address those concerns.
I agree.
So stay tuned on that.
Stay tuned on that one, that's
And
right.
one final question on the community, the district local technical assistance things that are coming at the next round. So if a community wanted to look in more depth about their zoning bylaws and consider
Yes,
adopting
perfect.
open space design,
Yes,
that is something.
we have done that. We have certainly done that. Berkeley did that. Several communities have done that, and we will be, you know, God willing, doing the 6th round next summer. So I think we issued it in June. We had the applications in July, and then we were finished with our review. Secretary Davey actually made the announcements at the last task force meeting. So now those projects will be getting underway, or some of them already are. So yeah,
Okay,
it's great resources for some of this stuff that you just don't have internally.
Right, and in the meantime, the staff at Mass Audubon, we do have some people who are trained planners, and I'm sure Serpent will provide some degree of assistance as well. So if you have a bylaw that you want to talk with us about in relation to this bylaw, certainly, you know, give me or Priscilla a call or email us, and we'll see how we can help. We'll find some help for you one way or another. Did you have another question, Priscilla?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up. Thanks, Jean. I really appreciate your coming.
I put the map in there for you.
Thank you. The purpose of developing the South Coast Rail Corridor Plan, or one of the purposes, was that we anticipated that once the rail is built, that will induce new growth, and that a lot of the open space resources that we treasure now will be at risk. And so that was why we asked the communities to identify the priority protection areas. And that was great. And as you say, it was an award-winning plan. But the plan in itself was not the end goal. The end goal was to actually preserve a lot of the open space as mitigation for the new growth.
Exactly.
So I guess my question is, once the final environmental impact statement comes out, once the permits are finalized, is there going to be, we're probably not going to have all the open space preserved at that point, the 100,000 acres or whatever. Is there going to be an ongoing effort or mechanism to keep this process of preserving the PPAs going? And obviously, getting communities to adopt open space bylaws would be a major component.
And Kurt could chime in too. I think that there's now, you know, a state culture that this is important. I think, Heidi, I think you identified it. This is critical for not just us here, but the Commonwealth in general. We've identified, it was in the slides, how much development has happened, how much sprawl has occurred. You know, we built the interstate highway system and encouraged the whole world to just spread out. And, you know, we're paying an enormous amount for gas, we're paying an enormous amount for what we're doing to our environment, we're paying an enormous amount in lost resources. So I believe that there is not going to be a change in philosophy at the state level, because this is self-preservation more than anything else. So for Southwest Rail, I will say, I think our plan, my understanding is that we'll revisit periodically. But we also have, and you know this, because we mentioned it at task force meeting, a very extensive mitigation plan that is part of the package, extensive.
I would just add that Executive Order 525, which
There
came
it
out
is.
of the course of her presentation, basically says to state agencies invest consistent with plan. In the case of my agency, that means land conservation dollars are to flow to priority preservation areas first and foremost in this region. It's something that, yes, that executive order directs us to do that, but we're also doing that for the I-495 region, where there's a second plan that's been produced, despite the fact there's no executive order applicable to that region. And I think the point is, there's a change in culture at this state level to basically say we are going to invest consistent with plans that we have helped produce in the case of Southwest Rail and 495, and every expectation that we're going to follow through in terms of investments, not just in conservation, but in infrastructure as well, consistent with those plans.
And Secretary Bielecki spoke at a conference that we hosted last Thursday up at Devon's, and he spoke eloquently about that and about really the win-win that we see from doing this planning for both development and for preservation, that they don't have to conflict, they can actually help each other, and doing not just this plan and the 495 plan, but now also up into the Merrimack Valley. The Central Mass Regional Planning Commissioner is doing similar plans in the Blackstone Valley, and also 13 communities sort of west of Worcester. I have a flyer out there about one of those projects, and there are regional forums coming up on that as well. So I think this is a process that's going to be flowing across the whole state, and there's a commitment to it.
Just a quick question. Is my way of thinking is that something that had the least amount of impact on the environment, and I don't know if it's been brought up or is it feasible, the use of monorails?
Yeah, very
I mean, to me, it
expensive.
seems to make sense.
And it hits the canopy, the tree canopy in a lot of places. We absolutely looked at that. Somebody said, just put a monorail up Route 24, you'd be golden. Well, there's like 80 bridges you'd knock down. So it became, again, we are responsible. My route is what we call the LEDPA, the least environmentally damaging practicable alternative. Try saying that fast. That's why we go with LEDPA. So the LEDPA is the one that is the most practicable and does the least amount of, has the least impact. There's nothing you can do anywhere in the world that isn't going to impact. Your charge is to do it responsibly. And that's what I think, and thanks to Governor Patrick and the whole administration and Secretary Davey and all the other agencies, I think we're trying to do this as a cohesive whole, and recognizing the smart growth principles have to be part of it. I love them.
Great, well, thank you all so much for coming, and yeah, let's thank our speakers again. Please do check out our website for resources. We have lots of links on there.